Hi everyone, we are back at the Disruption Network Club after our break, and we will start with the second panel of the day, but first we will show a video essay from Fiamma Montezemolo that introduces the panel. The video essay is called Traces. The artist and anthropologist Fiamma Montezemolo combines fieldwork-based research and art to create a mediation on border life between the United States and Mexico. Based on years of ethnographic work in Tijuana and an ascetic shooting schedule of 24 hours, Traces record Montezemolo's experiences in the region in a textured living portrait, a sort of biography of the wall separating Tijuana and San Diego. So I leave now the word to the video essay, and we come back later with the panel, Are Algorithm and Borders the New Jailers? Thank you.
You too have your own story, your own biography. You too were born in one place, and sooner or later you'll pass away in another. You too bring trouble to some and joy to others. You too live your ambivalences, like many do. If seen from below, as if from a low-angle shot, you signify limits, omnipotence. If seen from above, in a bird's eye view, you signify power, security, dominion. You signify the tangible margin between threat and protection. Who better than you embodies the frustration and possibility of living or dying? When I saw you for the first time, you reminded me, of course, of certain wars and destructions. Above all, the one of 1848, when your conception implicitly began, when your ancestors started conceiving you as a physical progeny, composed of barbed wire. And then, the Gulf War of the 90s. You are its direct offspring. Born there as an aircraft carrier to aid with the landing of US planes in Iraq, you have been transferred and placed as a dividing wall in this new geopoliticized space. You are between the Americas. You began as a wall, and recently you've multiplied into more layers, sometimes up to 3. Very thick and visibly always more inscrutable, accompanied at times by virtual resistance, at times by control towers, at times by sensors and furnishings that make you feel more virile with every immigrant body that you repel. An impossible panopticon. a limit that makes an entire nation into a gated community. After the fame of September 11th, you became denser, increasingly invigorated, and given great weight, like a father master that naively believes that he can protect his own offspring from imaginary enemies by bullying. Like a Don Quixote who fights the air around him with a sharp sword, facing many invisible enemies. But when I saw you for the first time, as an indelible image of the brutal effects of the interruption from the landscape that you provoke with your unwieldy presence, you also reminded me of the necessity, the possibility to transform you and transform ourselves, to pass through you. You remind me how you are penetrable after all, since millions of bodies continue to leap over you despite of all your resistances. You reminded me that the same landscape you try to dominate every instant makes your control impossible by opposing whole mountains and impervious lands against you and pitting your hateful linearity. Topography is not your friend. On the contrary, it often fiercely avers you. What happens to you happens to your European brothers, to those other border posts that oppose resistances in other strategic zones. You embody ambiguity. The same material that constitutes you, the steel that composes you, brings to mind the concept of bursting force, of impenetrability and resistance, we said. But then between me and you, we also know that you have your weaknesses, that you too corrode and become rust like everyone else. You too have a body that inevitably decays and blushes with time. I've seen it. I'm witness to it. day after day, the waters of the Pacific Ocean, from uterine waters for you transformed into cannibal ones. They eat you and spit out your remains, chew you and don't digest you, crumble you only to return you to the earth, into your inexorable destiny of mortal presence. An enraged Medea is all over you. Over the years, I waited patiently for the moment to collect your rusted remains, to analyze them, bottle them up, preserve them. The only way to understand you was to seal you in a test tube and perform alchemic transformations, capture your resistant constitution and your dissolution. Not to make you disappear, but to capture your shadow. Peter Schlemel taught us that we cannot liberate ourselves from our own shadows, if not at the cost of our own belonging. The alchemist transforms base metals like yours and makes them noble, processes them to extract the elixir of life from them, the panacea. I want to transform you in life. To transmute you means to transmute your unilateral power, transforming what you seek to discipline with a border in slippery multiplicity. Pulverizing is not to dismiss you completely, which would be impossible. But pulverizing you, the alchemist can change your material into something less threatening, more promising. It is possible to attack your questionable virility and convert it into its trace. I can transform your haunting presence into an uncanny one. If we are peopled by the other, you can't deal with your exclusive presence. You need to admit that the holes in you, those arms and legs that cross you, also people you, enrich you in some way. I cannot shut you up, but yes, I can intervene in your genealogy, in your folds. I can collect you as one collects forensic material and transport you into the laboratory of life. My proto-science makes you smile, I am sure. You are so arrogant after all. But believe me when I say that you cannot be the only one to imprison or create alterity. You'll then become a trace without a present, a past present only with an absence, dematerialized, cultivated in its exclusive affective dimension. In transforming, the alchemist transforms herself, and so your enlightenment will be mine. A new state for you will be a new state for me. I'd like to remind you of something Rainer Maria Rilke said. We are born somewhere provisionally, so to speak. Only little by little do we compose our place of origin within ourselves, so that we may be born there later and each day more definitively. So now, I am wondering, where do you want your place of origin to be? And where is mine?
Thank you, Fiamma, for this really great introspective piece. And now I would like to call on stage Sanjana Varghese, Fiamma Montezemolo, and also I would like to welcome from the online, our online participants, Srishti Jaswal and Petra Molnar. And I would like also to welcome on stage Sonja Peteranderl, that will be the moderator of this panel. So I will introduce Sonja, then Sonja will leave to you to introduce the panelists. Sonja Peteranderl is a journalist and the founder of Buzzing Cities Lab, a think tank focusing on the impact of technology on urban violence and organized crime. She's an algorithmic accountability reporting fellow at Algorithm Watch, investigating the impact of algorithms in policing and in the criminal justice system. Previously, she worked at Der Spiegel as editor and as Latin America correspondent based in Tijuana. She was senior editor at Wired Germany magazine and worked as a freelance foreign correspondent for German and international media outlets. So thank you, Sonja. Thank you, everyone, for being here, and also welcome to the other speakers online. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here and to have 4 brilliant panelists and experts on surveillance, on migration issues and technology to discuss a very crucial and increasingly important topic, if and how and to what extent algorithms and borders are the new jailers. And in a beautiful video essay, we just saw how beautifully, at first sight, the water plays around the border on the northern tip of Tijuana, the border city that is bordering San Diego, California. And on the one side, the kid is playing in the sand. On the other side, the US-American patrol is basically driving around. When you look at it, you think you could just dive into the water, just walk around the wall, actually, because it seems like just a couple of meters in the water, you could swim around it. And in fact, from time to time, migrants try to cross the border by sea. And it always happens, like every couple of months, that someone drowns in the water. The technology that we're talking about, the surveillance and the carceral technologies, are similar to that hidden, there's a hidden rip current under the water. You can't see it. Because when we look at it on the surface, we have no idea what's underneath, because we have tremendously deep learning and more complicated algorithms at play. And we have often no idea how big the impact is and who's impacted. And mostly when we look at these kind of systems, we see that the ones that drown first are vulnerable communities, are migrants, are people of colors who are really affected by these systems. And I want to discuss these problems today with 4 panelists, and I'm a bit sad that not all are live in Berlin. So digitally, we have Petra Molnar, a lawyer and an expert on technologies in the migration context. We have Srishti from India, Srishti Jaswal, and I'm happy that the sound is good, that we can hear you. We have on stage Fiamma Montezemolo, and last but not least, Sanjana Varghese. And we will start with Srishti, who has also experienced how technology can become a prison if you're targeted online by trolls. So it's not just that algorithms and scoring systems are increasingly deployed in prisons around the world, and that borders become kind of an extended zone for incarcerated technologies, but it's also that, for example, activists, journalists, and political opponents of governments or of right-wing movements become a target by the means of technology. Srishti Jaswal is an award-winning Indian journalist, and she covered, for example, the situation in border cities in Kashmir and minority issues, and she was targeted by online trolls, and that led to her kind of like losing her identity and also having to go undercover because she was threatened. And she also researched how these hate campaigns work on a more structural levels, how these trolls are trained in India. And she will tell us more about her research, her personal stories, and her upcoming book now.
Thank you so much. Very happy to be here. I'm just gonna start with my presentation. I hope that you can see it. If you can just tell me if it's there on the screen.
We can see it, thank you.
All right, so I am a digital prisoner as of now. My crime is expression of critical thoughts, and my trial is public shaming and trolling on social media. Hello, everyone. I'm Srishti Jaswal. I'm currently speaking from New Delhi. I was supposed to be in Berlin for this conference, but I was not issued my passport in time. Unfortunately, I'm not the only prisoner in this digital prison, so it's a little less lonely over here. In fact, today only, India's leading opposition leader, Rahul Gandhi, has also been jailed behind these digital bars and disqualified as a lawmaker for thoughts critical of India's far right Prime Minister, Mr. Narendra Modi. Um, with this, let me tell you my story. In June 2020, I replied to a Twitter thread about a movie called Krishna and his Leela. I was naive, I was young, I was frustrated at the state of the men. In the movie, protagonist sleeps with multiple women, and I had an objection with that because he was fooling most of the women just to sleep with them. But the protagonist of the movie shared the same name as Hindu god Krishna, and my tweet was spread with fake claims that I have insulted Hindu god Krishna. My tweet was in June, but the outrage started in July after a poem by me on Kashmir became viral on social media. Since there was nothing wrong on that poem, so they took this particular out of context tweet and then spread it. This is a copy of my tweet, which was shared by far right, and you can see that there's a picture of me in a skirt, which actually suggests that I am certain kind of a woman who can really call Krishna a fuck boy. Most of the people in India don't even understand the meaning of fuck boy, and they thought that I am abusing Lord Krishna. And then what happened after that was crazy. So I clarified, I also put out a statement, I also apologized that this has nothing to do with Lord Krishna. It's actually about a movie character named Krishna, but the threats didn't stop. In fact, the threats increased so much that my employers were targeted, and they had no choice but eventually to terminate me. Thousands and thousands of trolls were tagging them within a span of few hours, asking them to terminate me, and within half a day they suspended me and then eventually terminated me. It did not stop the barrage of trolls that happened over the time. So over here, it's just a one of the trolls that happened and still present on the Twitter. So it says that, can someone give me the exact location or phone number of this prostitute, Srishti Jaswal? I will brutally rape this motherfucker whore, and I will cut her vagina in small pieces and bang her ass in half. I don't read this further because it's too uh, weird. This is one of the many, many, many threats that I got online. I would also like to show you the another one. If you can play the video that I shared with you, the team can play that video.
तो भैया सृष्टि जायसवाल जिसने हमारे श्री कृष्ण भगवान को गाली दी थी फाइनली उसके लोड़े लग चुके हैं। भाई उसकी नौकरी चली गई। उस कुतिया भड़वे की नौकरी जा चुकी है। सृष्टि जायसवाल जिसे श्री कृष्ण को गाली दी थी दोस्तों, उसकी नौकरी चली गई। ऐसे कुत्ते और हरामी लोगों का भाई यही इलाज होता है।
I think now we can stop it because the man keeps on repeating the same thing and just calls me an agent of China, this and that, just goes on and on. It's really gross. But this was the form of trolling that was happening. The worst part of it was that even my parents were not spared. My father was threatened that our only source of income, our shop, would be burned, and my sisters were also abused quite a lot, that they had to deactivate their social media profiles. um, when all of this was going on, I had this question: why would they target me? How did it happen? When did it start? Was it because of my identity as a woman reporter? How did they find me? And as after losing my job, being confined to a digital prison, I had nothing to do, but just I kept on observing these people and started doing what I knew that I could do. I started investigating them. I started looking into the patterns. I started looking into how I was not the only person who was trolled in this way, but many others as well. My investigation led me to the dynamics of this digital prison. Over there, you can see that there is a Hindu IT cell. This particular IT cell has very close association with India's far right, and they claim to save religion digitally. So they go after anybody who they perceive is against their religion. So I infiltrated this Hindu IT cell, uh, going undercover after a couple of months when this happened to me. And over there I realized that it's a training ground. People were taught how to troll people, people were taught how to file legal complaints, how to get maximum benefit out of the case studies such as me. And often this was based on fake news with misleading context, but it had so many big number of followers. Like for instance, in this particular, in my case, nearly 3,000 people were there when they asked my tweet to be amplified. These are a couple of screenshots from that infiltration. As you can see that they are counting how many complaints have been filed against me, and then they're also sharing a draft. um, and people who actually file complaints against me, they are rewarded by followers and shout out on social media. And also to a very large extent it was an artificial outrage. So this particular man, Ash Anshul, is one of the far right influencer, or a troll, if I may say him, or a jailer of this digital prison. So this exact text has been copied multiple times on social media, and I have reproduced these four texts so far, but there are multiple such texts which have just copied his tweet and just created an artificial outrage online. In this particular story, it's not just him, but so many other places where trolling happened, so many other far right organizations which came together and just went all over against me. And for a while it just felt like as if there are thousands of people shouting against me, speaking ill of me, thinking of raping me, or I just don't even have words as of now while explaining this. And I was there alone in a room, often shifting from one place to another because it felt so unsafe that what if somebody really comes and rapes me? And I would say that this was no less than a digital prison. These are the admins of this particular IT cell as I investigated them. So I took a break of a few months after being trolled, and I started looking into this particular IT cell, that who are the founders of this IT cell, how does it function, how the people are recruited, how it happens. I also reached out to the other victims who had been trolled in a very similar fashion, that really was an infringement of their human rights. And I found that they have very close association with BJP. So over here, you can see the founders and the admins of BJP Hindu IT cell with India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and these two are only a few of these people. There are thousands and hundreds of such blue tick jailers who act as super spreaders of propaganda. Um, so while investigating this particular bit, I think a week after we reached out to these founders for comment, I got to know that there has been a police complaint registered against me under India's blasphemy laws. That police complaint in itself became another reason for me to get into the hiding. So it was not just the social media, but also the state, which reinforced this digital prison and the idea of confinement in me. So I had to be in hiding from January 2021 to March 2021 for nearly 3 months. I was not able to use my cell phone, credit card. I was not able to use any of my social media. Even if I had to speak to my parents, I had to use my friends or somebody else's phone, because if in case I was traced, then the police would arrest me. And the police had filed this complaint on insistence of the Hindu IT cell. So it's not just merely digital, but it has a very real physical offline impact as well. It's no less than a digital prison. And I don't think so there is any better way to really express that those 3 months of my life. I can really say that I have a first-hand experience of understanding how it feels when your personal liberties are just taken away from you. I had to lose my identity. I couldn't use my name. I removed my surname from everywhere else because they could target my family. I had to just be in hiding. And for months, it kept on going. I am not the only prisoner of this digital prison. There are multiple such people. This IT cell has targeted multiple people. It's not just journalists, it's also lawyers, activists, even doctors, whosoever actually dissents against this particular regime. They don't spare them at all. And eventually, they make a case study of me. So, this is me, and they have just taken my photograph from my college. Um, I think school or college or something like that. And in this particular poster, they say that I have lost my job, I've lost my reputation, and I also have a case against me. Now, will I dare to insult their God? So, the case against me was registered in 2021. It kept on going for 2 years. Finally, in February this year, the case against me was dismissed. But in these 2 years of state-sponsored digital prison, I had to self-censor myself. I was spied and there was surveillance. I also had to obtain permission from authorities if I had to travel. And as of now, I don't have a passport. And my passport is denied to me because of a spelling mistake. My question is, I have no idea when this will end. I don't know if I'm a prisoner for life because whenever any other story has to come, my new work is there, I again get targeted and trolled. So over here, I end my presentation, and I want to ask you all that what do you really perceive of this digital prison?
Thank you so much, Srishti, to share your horrible experience that highlights one of like a global trend that coordinated attacks against very often female politicians and journalists and activists kind of try to silence them and also expel them from the media landscapes, from the political landscapes, from public platforms and spaces. And I think what you just told us illustrates how far this can go. We will surely have more questions to you at the end of the other presentation. Thank you very much. And
You're welcome.
Sanjana Varghese will now give us some insights in her work. She's also dealing with violence. She works for Airwars in the UK, an organization that tracks air attacks in countries like Syria or Iraq. And they also try to investigate the human toll these attacks take on civilians. And she's a journalist writing for media outlets like Wired magazine. And she's covering, for example, migration technologies and how migrants are affected by these technological dragnets in the UK.
Hello? Oh, you can hear me. Great. Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Great. Thank you so much for inviting me. And hi, good evening. I'm Sanjana. I just have to say thank you very quickly to Tatiana, Daniela, and everyone else at Disruption Network Lab. And I'm really honored to be here on this panel among so many people whose work I admire so much. So I'll introduce myself briefly, and then I'll talk a bit more about the kind of work that I do. So I'm an investigative journalist. I'm a researcher and a visual researcher and a reporter. I work across a range of issues. So as Sonja mentioned, I primarily work at Airwars, which is a watchdog organization that monitors civilian harm and airstrikes. So I work on our investigations unit. We deploy a range of methods such as aesthetic research, open source intelligence, as well as very traditional kind of reporting methods. The rest of the time, as Sonja mentioned, I write and I report for Wired, The Baffler, The Economist, The Guardian, and elsewhere. So it's in this capacity, actually, that I join this panel today. A lot of my work, generally speaking, tries to interrogate and deal with the relationship between bureaucracy and secrecy and how this dynamic shifts with new technologies, new actors, new systems, and new forms of knowledge. So this quote above is from an artist and a writer whose work has had a big influence on me. His name is Trevor Paglin. And so he writes about how secrecy has a spatial component. So the text is called Goatsucker, and it's actually about F-16 stealth fighters that were tested in the deserts of the US in the 80s. It's a great read, I'd recommend it. But he argues that things or processes or objects or systems that are secret are inevitably revealed by or made of non-secret things. So I often try and take a similar approach to my work, although our subject matter differs. Since I started working as a journalist, I've often found myself focusing on the incursion of algorithmic and digital systems into public life and public space. So I'm particularly interested in and worried about the way that algorithmic infrastructures can further entrench discrimination, on marginalized groups under the guise of neutrality and opacity. So as many of my co-panelists and other speakers at this conference will explain, automated technologies and forms of algorithmic monitoring are increasingly really central to governance, and particularly the governance of migration. People on the move and people who are racialized are often used as test subjects for discriminatory tools, surveillance technologies, and so on. So in the next 12 minutes, I'll talk a bit more about these specific areas that I look at, some of the methods that I and others use to better understand this and cast light on these issues, as well as why it's important to try and do so. So one of the big shifts in this area, which I think is relatively under-discussed and what I tend to focus on, is the growth of massive sprawling databases. So these are often operationalized into carrying out more and more state functions, not just like in the global north, but really anywhere around the world that technology has an impact on state administration. So the kind of proliferation of databases that we often see really is part of a temporal and material shift in state administration. It's about how the state conceives of its subjects, and it inevitably is kind of geared towards surveillance and control. So I've kind of narrowed to this focus on databases because I think they really reshape contemporary life in opaque ways. Often databases are really embedded in political and administrative systems to the point that they're not really seen as technological or like smart interventions anymore, and there's very little transparency about how they work. So about 2 years ago, I initially began to undertake detailed research into this at the Center for Research Architecture at Goldsmiths. So I started to look at the production and spread of immigration databases in the UK, which really meant that migrants of all kinds, not just those who were considered irregularized, were increasingly being surveilled through electronic means. So I have to explain a bit of the policy context, explain how this kind of works in practice. So in the UK, about a decade ago, the then British Prime Minister Theresa May rolled out something called the hostile environment. So it just basically means that more and more members of society, people who don't work for the Home Office, which is the government department that oversees migration and policing in the UK. So people who don't work for the Home Office, like hospital administrators, landlords, bank clerks, increasingly have to check immigration status. So this is, for example, I as a migrant, I have to hand over a copy of my visa to someone like a hospital administrator, a bank clerk, someone who works at a university to prove that I have the right to actually do any of those things. So until recently, this is in the form of a physical object, which is known as the biometric residence permit. It's like a card you carry around. Increasingly, this has become digitized. So technology is a bigger part of how the Home Office administers immigration status in the UK, but this has really accelerated in the past 5 years. It's an internal policy drive, but it's also a shift that really has a huge material effect on migrant populations in the UK. So now many migrants in the UK, like myself, now only have digital proof of our immigration status, which is what the Home Office calls digital by default. This means that if you want to prove your immigration status to one of these services, you have to use this thing called a share code, which is about 8 random characters. So when I started a new job last year, I shared my share code with my new employer. They put it into their side of what's called the status checking portal, which is a huge database. I obviously can't show a screenshot of that because I don't have access to it. So this move of from physical proof of immigration status to digital status is really framed, I think, internally and externally as a good thing. It's seen as sleek and neutral and modern and efficient. But in reality, these databases are really worrying when they work, and they're worrying when they fail too. So for Wired last year, the piece that I wrote, I spoke to a range of migrants and migrants' rights organizations who'd really run into so many issues with these new digital systems. I'm going to try and read a bit of that excerpt now to try and explain how that works in practice. It's quite a harrowing example, so I'll read it out loud. In 2019, Anna moved from Poland to the UK with her partner and 3 children. Soon after they settled into their home and new life, her partner became violent. Anna attempted to leave, taking their children with her, but when she contacted her local council's social services, they asked her about her immigration status. So Anna, which is a pseudonym, had a valid visa under the EU settlement scheme, which required European citizens to register with the British immigration authorities after Brexit in 2017. But when she tried to prove that she had a valid visa, she couldn't. She'd never received a text message or a physical letter saying that she'd settled status. So Anna had to basically go back into this household with her children and her abuser with nowhere else to go. Anna then got in touch with the immigration authorities, so the Home Office, and they put her through to a technical team who she says rarely called her back, and they were really busy. They had long waiting times, often like hours at a time, which is really difficult to navigate when you've got young kids. Once she actually got through to the helpline, they confirmed she had made a valid application and that her children had settled status, but they couldn't give her access to her account, and crucially, they couldn't give her access to her share code. So without it, she couldn't basically access any services like getting a job, she couldn't rent an apartment, she couldn't get support for her kids. So after another serious incident a couple of months later, the police gave her abuser an injunction, which meant that he wasn't allowed to contact her. Anna left the house, but she actually lost a job offer because she couldn't prove her immigration status. She couldn't apply for benefits because she didn't have proof that she was actively working because she kept losing job offers. In March last year, she received confirmation through a charity that she was working with that she had pre-settled status, but she still hasn't been contacted by the UK's Home Office, and she actually still has no access to her share code, even a year later. So this kind of digital hostile environment was rolled out under the guise of efficiency and techno-solutionism, the presumption that more information is always better. Anna's example actually isn't really rare at all. So hundreds of people have faced issues with these share codes alone, let alone loads of the other parts of this digital hostile environment. This kind of technological optimization, which is couched in a very neutral form of language, is spreading throughout not just immigration, but all kinds of public services, and it has these really devastating effects. So I could talk about this for hours, but I really want to come to the main point, which is that this kind of monitoring and control is only really possible through the proliferation of these big, sprawling databases, all of which has really expanded in 2012, since 2012, when Theresa May institutionalized the hostile environment. So what you're seeing above is a screen recording of a platform that I produced. So through conversations with individuals and organizations who have lived experience of navigating the UK's immigration system, I produced something called Difference Engines, so it's still online. And so what I'm trying to do is interrogate the relationships and kind of contractors and kind of all the systems that make up this side of the digital hostile environment. So one of the big challenges of working in this area is that the Home Office is actually very secretive, surprise, even though much of their public-facing work in the last couple of years has emphasized how central technology really is to how it administers immigration. The growth of kind of technology and technologically oriented administration is a huge part of how the UK runs a lot of its public services. So now there's like a ton of profit-making firms that have multi-million-pound contracts basically carrying out state-sponsored violence. So there's a couple of different pages and parts of this platform you can see here. But one thing that I want to focus on is the next part, if I can get there. There we go. Which is something called the network map. So it's a very incomplete attempt to map out all the relationships, contractors, state bodies, state agencies that are involved in the production of just one database that's quite big and very much active in the UK. So I focused on something called the Home Office Biometrics and Strategic Central Bureau platform, because I think biometrics are a really fascinating case study in how databases become operationalized and spatialized. So I found the names of suppliers who'd been given like hundreds and thousands of pounds to maintain these databases. As you can see, it's about like 10 companies, all of which carry out different but intertwined functions. Some of them are really well known and have huge contracts like IBM. Some of them are more specialized like Leidos. So this database, the Home Office Biometrics and Strategic Central Bureau platform, connects biometric databases around the UK so that the police forces can access more than just police biometrics databases, but they can also access the immigration biometrics databases. So these were then operationalized through a fingerprint scanner, which is produced by the company Motorola, which is the parent company of the mobile phone producer. So you can actually see here the commercial leaflet that the company provides to advertise its services. So the scanner relies on a piece of software which is called the Biometric Services Gateway. So even though there's often no clear reason for a police officer to search both the immigration biometrics database and the police biometrics database, they tend to do so most of the time. Police officers are able to use this fingerprint scanner if they have suspicion that someone is not who they say they are, which is the exact phrasing from promotional materials and kind of press that police forces did at the time. So this is initially trialed in West Yorkshire in the north of England. So someone could come up on the fingerprint scanner if they actually have a visa, even if they don't have any reason to be detained, even if they haven't broken any immigration laws. The occurrence of a positive match in and of itself sends back a kind of notification to the Immigration Enforcement Command and Control Unit who carry out immigration raids. So there's a great organization called the Racial Justice Network in the UK that have documented how this tends to disproportionately affect marginalized groups. They found that it's disproportionately black people, often black men, who are stopped and scanned in this way. And in general, people of color were 6 times as likely as their white counterparts up and down the UK, so around the whole of kind of the union, to be stopped and scanned in this way. So I actually asked for the training materials used by police forces when they access the scanner. I got given this, which is module 1, so very basic. You can see how the scanner is kind of deployed in the broadest possible terms. This isn't all of it, and this is like just some choice slides, but you can see how the use of this fingerprint scanner is talked about internally as like a justification for how police forces conceive of them. I mean, to move on to my next point, the prevalence of profit-making firms in the UK's immigration environment is really frustrating for a range of reasons. One is that it produces an alibi for a lack of transparency. So I filed Freedom of Information Act requests, which is what you can see here. Sorry, they're not like super detailed. It's a really valuable way of finding out information about public bodies. But in the last couple of years, the commercial imperative has really overridden public interest justifications for releasing information about these contracts. So I often find that my FOIAs are refused on this basis. So firms can make like millions of pounds of profit from producing infrastructure such as this police scanner, or even in like providing cloud storage for like immigration databases, but releasing information about these projects or these products through public information requests puts that company at a commercial disadvantage, and so your request can be refused on that basis. So these kinds of relationships between private firms and state bodies can be very frustrating, but actually they can also provide a way into understanding the contours of these systems in a way that you might not be able to do just if you try to get information from the state. So for example, Motorola provides updates, and they actually have a monthly newsletter where they discuss which police force around the UK is now deploying this fingerprint scanner. So you can actually FOIA that specific authority and ask how it's being used, how much money they're spending on it, if they're collecting like equity or equality related data, so kind of data about whether it's affecting one group proportionally or not. And you can actually look at hands-on demos of how this technology is being tried, because again, these companies have an incentive to sell their products. So as you can see above, it's a screenshot from a very hands-on demonstration of that fingerprint scanner. So you can actually get information that you wouldn't be able to get if you asked through traditional means, and you can find out with like a lot of granularity how these products actually work. So you can really track how a technology or a certain piece of software or even a certain company may increasingly be operational within more and more state services, which brings me to my next point. So increasingly in the UK, you also see the rise of what Monish Bhatia, who's an incredible academic, calls crimmigration, which is where policing and immigration are increasingly rolled up into one, where any migrant is treated as suspect. So one example of this is the use of GPS tagging and more kinds of apparatus to monitor migrants who are out on bail in the UK. So if you've been incarcerated and you're a migrant, you'll have to wear the kind of ankle tag that you see above on release. It tracks your location data 24/7, and it stores it in a database that's accessible to general people or specific people at the Home Office, So this kind of trail data can reveal a lot about an individual, so whether someone is participating in political movements, for example, through membership in a trade union, whether they go to a specific site of worship. And despite concerns from civil rights groups and migrants' rights organizations, the Home Office actually maintains the right to access this data for use in specific kinds of legal interventions. So there's something called a Section 8 appeal, which is where a foreign national who may be deported can make an appeal to stay in the UK on the basis of their private or family life. So they could argue, for example, that they have a child, a young child that they're co-parenting. The Home Office could then technically, legally, and it has done this, access trail data from their ankle monitor and try and rebut that argument. So they could say, this individual actually doesn't actively participate in this child's life because we don't see that they're at a certain school enough times of the week to be participating in pickup. We don't see that they're at an extended family member's house enough times of the week. And so it sounds very dystopian, it sounds quite far-fetched, but it's possible, legal, and has already happened in the UK. So these kinds of dynamics are now being further entrenched. It's worth noting that the impact of this surveillance and this monitoring is quite debilitating. So speaking to The Guardian, Mo, who's a migrant who's been surveilled in this way, explained that his feet were swelling and bleeding. It was really tight. It got infected. He had no idea when the tag was going to be taken off. He was saying that he felt bad, he felt down, he felt anxious, and he felt that he didn't have his freedom like other people do. And many other people who are kind of on the same condition, so they have to wear this GPS tag or be re-imprisoned, described not being able to participate in social situations. So they couldn't go to things like a public pool because they didn't want to make other people uncomfortable. They couldn't take their children on play dates because other parents had questions about why they were wearing a GPS tag. So I mean, these kind of technologies are really spreading, and you really also see this in more recent policy changes in the UK. So asylum seekers, people who are fleeing often violence and persecution, are now increasingly being tagged as they arrive in the UK. So they get off the small boats, and it's one of the first things that happens. And so you can see how forms of monitoring and control that are produced in one context often then get spread out and operationalized and moved on to more and more groups that are deemed suspect. So in these examples I've walked through, you can kind of see this through line, which is how algorithmic monitoring and a drive for more data effectively reconstitutes or tries to redraw how certain groups interact with the world. It kind of produces an algorithmic respatialization of public space. In the case of the people with electronic GPS tags, it also produces an algorithmic reconstitution of private space. There's much more I'd like to say, but I'm going to finish with this quote from Ursula Franklin, who's an incredible academic, Canadian academic. She kind of summed up the difficulty of trying to understand and talk about the subject matter really well. She has this quote and she says, "How do you speak about something which is both fish and water, something which is both means and end?" So I'll end on that. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Sanjana, for your insights into the messiness and opacity of interconnected databases that are really hard to investigate. And you also brought up the connections between public and private institution in the technology and tracking field. I think we will talk about this later also. And what you mentioned about electronic ankles and GPS tracking, stuff like that, and also happens in Mexico, for example, in the US border zone, so that migrants who also have these traumatic experiences with incarceration, that they have to wear the electronic ankles and have to check in via phones, cell phones, and are tracked all along the way. And I'm pretty sure that these technology will also play a part in the next talk we have, because Petra Molnar is here. She's a lawyer and an anthropologist, and she's an expert in the impacts of migration technologies on people crossing borders. She co-runs the Refugee Law Lab at York University and the Migration Technology Monitor, which funds community-grounded projects on border technology. Petra is also working on a book, and it's called Artificial Border, AI Surveillance and Border Tech Experiments, and we are looking forward to hear more from you, Petra, on your insights that you generated in the past years doing fieldwork in various border zones in the world.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction, and it's a real pleasure to be here with you, at least virtually. I'm really sorry that I was not able to be there in person, but I hope that I will be able to share with you a little bit about some of the work that I have been doing over the last 5 years, tracking how new technologies of border management, so things like surveillance, automated decision-making, and various other experimental projects are playing out in migration across the world. Most recently, my colleague Florian Schmitz and I were in Palestine, perhaps the sharpest manifestation of these technologies of apartheid and imprisonment that we are talking about today. But before I get into the kind of substantive portion of my remarks, I always want to start off with a little bit of positionality, because trying to document this system of technological oppression is itself always a risky business, one that's fraught with opaque decisions, secretive private sector players, like Sanjana mentioned, and also the witnessing of horrific conditions that are on the frontiers of the world's borders that challenge our very common humanity. So how does one carefully and critically document these very real human rights abuses that are in their nature difficult to see sometimes? And it's also about bigger questions that I hope to tease out with you today. Whose perspectives matter when talking about innovation, and which priorities take precedence? What does critical representation and meaningful participation look like, including photography and representation that foregrounds people's agency and doesn't contribute to the so-called poverty porn that's so common in representations that are coming from spaces of forced migration? For example, you'll notice in my photos, I do not show the faces of people, nor do I kind of try and replicate the imagery of mass movement and uncontrollable hordes of people crossing borders that we often see in the news, in media, in international organization reports, and things like that. The images are carefully curated to rather show you perhaps what it feels like to be in these spaces. And because I'm also a lawyer, I like to always ask, are human rights framings enough, or are we also silencing the systemic and collective nature of these harms? And are we really doing enough to create space for abolitionist conversations around border tech too? So for me, in order to tell this global story of power and violence and innovation and contestation, I rely on the sometimes uneasy mix between law and anthropology. So it's a slow and a trauma-informed ethnographic methodology, one that really does require years of being present in a place to try and understand and unravel the strands of power and privilege, story and memory that make up the spaces where people's lives unfold. Because indeed, borders kill. An already violent border policy and regime is increasingly being sharpened through the use of digital technologies that are developed for the purposes of border control and migration management. And, we're talking about technologies that separate families, push people into life-threatening terrain, and already exacerbate historical and systemic discrimination that is the daily reality for people on the move and other marginalized communities. And as was already mentioned, borders also serve as testing grounds. They're kind of the perfect laboratory for these high-risk technological experiments, because they're places where regulation and lawmaking is already deliberately limited. And we're talking about a place with this kind of anything goes frontier attitude that informs the development and deployment of surveillance, often at the expense of people's lives. So really, when we're trying to understand the impact of these various migration management and border tech experiments, things like AI lie detectors, surveillance drones, a variety of automated decision-making tools, the huge databases that Sanjana was telling us about, it's always important to bring it back to the ground and consider the broader ecosystem in which these technologies develop. Because this is an ecosystem that's increasingly replete with the criminalization of movement, anti-migrant sentiments, and even practices of pushbacks that are leading to thousands of deaths at the border. Because really, at every point of a person's migration journey now, they are impacted by risky and unregulated technologies that are controlling their movement. Some of the technology has been around for a while. You're seeing some photos from the US-Mexico corridor, which has for a while been at the epicenter of a lot of surveillance technologies that kind of creates this broader dragnet. And in February of last year, I was in the Sonora Desert with some colleagues to try and firsthand see the impacts of some of these technologies that are being tested out. So what you're seeing here, for example, is an AI-powered surveillance tower that they're dotted throughout the Sonora corridor between the US and Mexico border, and they're an Israeli technology company. But I think I had one of the most surreal moments of my entire career when we were in the Sonora. I was literally on the sand in the desert when the Department of Homeland Security announced that they are planning to now roll out these so-called robo-dogs, essentially a quadruped military-grade technology that's now joining the global arsenal of border enforcement. So I know that this sounds a bit like an episode of Black Mirror or something very dystopic and something far off into the future. But it's really not just about the technology, it's about what it creates. And unfortunately, the future is not just more tech, it will likely be more death. Because thousands of people have already perished making the dangerous crossings. Like Mr. Alvarado, who was a young husband and father from Central America. We visited his memorial site after trekking for hours through the desert with a search and rescue group, the Battalion Search and Rescue. Mr. Alvarado was in search of a better life, and he succumbed mere kilometers away from a major highway. I think what people forget is that, oftentimes governments say that surveillance and smart borders are a way to deter or stop people from coming. But the problem is people will continue to move. They will keep coming, and surveillance does not deter them. Instead, what happens is people are forced to increasingly change their routes towards less inhabited terrain, leading to more loss of life, like Mr. Alvarado. This doesn't just happen at the US-Mexico border, but also along the fringes of Europe. And really, it's not as far-fetched now to think that in the not-so-distant future, people like Mr. Alvarado will be pursued by high-speed military-grade technology that's designed to kill. I always like to include this photo as well. For me, it really highlights the kind of absurdity of the border. This is the infamous Trump wall, or rather a section of it. It runs or bisects the Sonora along the Camino del Diablo, the Devil's Highway, and you can walk up to it and kind of feel its steely presence, and then you have a rust stain on your hand for the rest of the day. But it also kind of just ends in the middle of nowhere, and you can climb up that hill and poke your head into Mexico. The absurdity of borders. But of course, the US-Mexico frontier is not the only region where violent border and migration technologies are being deployed, in particularly because the conversation of our panel today is to focus on smart prisons. I've been mostly based in Greece and along the edges of Europe since 2020, and which has been the kind of frontier site of a lot of the technologies that are being tested out. Again, this is a region where a lot of people have been coming from, particularly since 2015 and 2016, and various entities are playing around with different technologies. Frontex, the European Border Agency, has been very proudly piloting various drones and aerostat machines, signaling their predisposition towards using predictive analytics or large data sets to try and predict the behavior of people as they're moving. Border walls have been extended, and even more very experimental technologies have been played out, like a sound cannon or a long-range acoustic device that made its way to the Greek-Turkey land border. And this is, again, all the while new deaths at the border continue to be reported. We've specifically also been tracking the rise of new prison-like refugee camps on the Aegean Islands, so the islands that separate Greece and Turkey, because they are increasingly part of this virtual fortress Europe, such as the photo that you're seeing right now from the island of Kos. And interestingly enough, Kos is also one of the sites of an EU-funded project called RoBorder. Also, as a side note, I just love the names of these projects. I mean, not only are they very dystopic, but there's something about, iBorder Control, RoBorder, Avatar, Palantir, kind of this very tech bro fantasy landscape that I think needs to be explored, but I digress. RoBorder specifically aims to, and this is a direct quote, create a fully functional autonomous border surveillance system with unmanned mobile robots, including aerial, water surface, underwater, and ground vehicles. But I would urge you to think about where these resources would be better spent instead of on surveillance technology. The island of Samos is yet another site where border technology and violence intersect. I was there for the opening of a brand new camp, the first one of these 5 that are being rolled out in Greece back in September 2021. And they're all, again, funded by the European Union. These camps are replete with all sorts of high-tech interventions, but it's important to note that the Samos camp did not have running water 2 weeks before its opening. So I spent some time on the eve of the opening with a young mom who was pushing her little daughter in a stroller, and we were sitting down for a while, speaking about how she was feeling about this essentially forcible transfer into this high-tech, highly securitized camp. And she quickly typed out this message: if we go there, we will go crazy. And it's not hard to understand why, because this is what the new camps look like. They're surrounded by layers of barbed wire, which of course is very familiar to those of us who work in these spaces. It's in a way almost been normalized that barbed wire and refugee camps go together, which is a whole other issue to be discussed, of course. And of course, the geographic segregation of these camps, they're oftentimes very far away from major urban centers. But these new camps, again, are funded by the EU, and they include algorithmic motion and risk detection surveillance, fingerprint scanning, and even virtual reality glasses for the Greek border guards to wear to monitor people living inside. But, I want to zoom out a bit and look at why this is happening. From a legal perspective, of course, I think it's pretty obvious that border technologies have profound impacts on people's lives and civil liberties, and human rights too, of course. Privacy rights are impacted when really sensitive data is shared either with repressive governments that people are trying to flee or with different agencies, for example, when immigration collaborates with law enforcement, or even when international organizations like the UN inappropriately shares sensitive information with a government, which has happened already across the world. Freedom of movement, of course, is impacted, and non-discrimination, which we will get into, and even these really, really fundamental ideas that underpin the way that our refugee law regime works, these ideas of non-refoulement, or not returning somebody into a place that they're trying to seek safety from. And of course, the right to life, liberty, and security of the person as well, when pushbacks and border interdictions are increasingly being facilitated by predictive analytics and surveillance technologies. But for me, it's about these broader, bigger questions, right? Like, when and why have we decided that these are the appropriate tools to use, particularly when currently very little governance and regulation actually exists for when things go wrong? And as we've already seen in this panel today, things often do go wrong. Not only have many of us had difficult experiences trying to get a work permit, reunite with our spouse, adopt a baby, move across borders, get visas for conferences, things are just getting more and more complicated as increasingly migration is automated through algorithmic decision-making and automated surveillance. People have already been wrongfully deported as a result of facial recognition mismatches, including 7,000 students from the UK that were accused of cheating on a language acquisition test because an algorithm made a mistake. But really, from a legal perspective, it presents a very basic question. What if you wanted to challenge some of these automated decisions that made a mistake that had profound impacts on your life? Where does liability and responsibility lie? Is it with the designer of the algorithm? Is it with the coder? Is it with the immigration officer that uses it? Or is it the algorithm itself? Should an algorithm have legal personality in a court of law? Kind of like a corporation. I mean, these are kind of far-fetched questions, but not really, because we are getting there. Increasingly, more and more algorithmic decision-making is being challenged in court. And it's really important that we start thinking about what we are really doing when we're introducing these technologies into the border zone. But perhaps this is where the central kind of corpus of my work over the last 5 years lies. What I have seen time and time again at all these different borders is that this creation of this legal black hole or lack of global governance is absolutely deliberate. And why is that? It's because it allows for this creation of these opaque zones where we can experiment with really high-risk technology that would simply just not be allowed to be done in other places. And again, it's because migrants, people on the move, refugees, stateless people, and everyone who is mobile has for a while been kind of this feared other, a group that must be regulated, managed for the purposes of efficiency and global security. And really, we also have these really powerful global north actors making decisions about people who are migrating from other places that are considered undesirable. And this is where the technology comes in, some of the examples that we've seen today. It's about this repeated spectacle, this kind of national security, must know about where people are coming from, border control at the exclusion of others, particularly done in a space where very little law or no law exists. And this is where the context of immigration decision-making really is key. We are already talking about an incredibly discretionary world, where you, for example, have two immigration officers looking at the exact same set of evidence and making two completely different, yet equally legally valid decisions. That's the way it works. That's the way it's always worked. And now, unfortunately, we are seeing technologies muddy the waters even more. And as we've seen from the other panelists as well, we already know that a lot of this technology is very discriminatory and racist against people of color. And often algorithmic decision-making relies on biased data sets, which render biased results. For me, one of the most visceral examples is the AI lie detector project that I mentioned. So for those of you who have been keeping track, I'm referring to the iBorder Control project, another one of those names. Now we have an iPhone, iPad, and iBorder Control. It was essentially a EU-funded project that purported to use facial recognition or micro-expression analysis to be able to determine whether somebody is more likely than not telling the truth at the border. I mean, there's a whole discussion about whether it even works or not. But, from a refugee law perspective, how can an AI lie detector deal with differences in cross-cultural communication? or the fact that many of us have worked with people who don't feel comfortable making eye contact with someone of the opposite gender due to culture, religion, or a variety of other factors. And what about the impact of trauma on memory? And the fact that we know that we don't tell stories in a linear way anyway, least of all the most difficult traumatic stories that we hold within ourselves. How can an AI lie detector deal with that if human decision makers already have issues with these complex factors? But really, just to wrap it up so that we have enough time for the remainder of the panel and for a fulsome discussion, for me, at the end of the day, this is not really about the technology. It's about these broader questions. Questions around which communities get to participate in conversations around proposed innovation, and which groups of people become testing grounds for border tech experiments. And as Sanjana so clearly already explained, why does the private sector time and time again get to determine what we innovate on and why? Oftentimes in these really problematic public-private partnerships, which states are increasingly keen to make in this kind of AI arms race that we're seeing geopolitically. Of course, there's big money to be made by big tech and border tech, and we're talking about a hugely lucrative border industrial complex, with billions of euro now on the line. So really, it is about this hubris of big tech and this allure of quick fixes that do not address the systemic reasons why people are forced to migrate and why these profound inequities and power differentials continue to exist. I mean, really, whose priorities matter when we choose to create violent sound cannons or AI lie detectors at the border instead of using AI to root out racist border guards? That's a clear decision and a normative one that the private sector gets to set. So really, in these years of on-the-ground research and hundreds of conversations with people on the move who've been at the sharpest edges of technological experimentation, for me, what comes out time and again is that the current lack of global governance, the lack of law, and the lack of transparency is very deliberate because it creates this perfect laboratory for high-risk experiments, making people on the move a testing ground. Because ultimately, technology is about power, and it replicates power structures in our society. And unfortunately, oftentimes the viewpoints and the experiences of those who are most routinely affected are excluded from the discussion almost entirely. So really, we need to recognize that the use of technology is never neutral. It's a political exercise, which again highlights how this allure of quick fixes and techno-solutionism doesn't really address the historical reasons, the systemic reasons, and increasingly also the environmental reasons why people are marginalized and why they're forced to migrate in the first place. I'll leave it there, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Petra, for laying bare not just very concrete examples of border technology in a largely unchecked area and experimentation hub, as you called it, but also widening this picture from the concrete technology projects to the framing also by companies, by states, in the public discussion, and also to the very complex questions of responsibilities and whom to take accountable. We will surely catch up with this issue in the discussion. Now I want to invite Fiamma Montezemolo. My Italian is not too good, unfortunately. She's both an artist and an anthropologist, and she's an established scholar in border studies and professor in the Department of Cinema and Digital Media at the University of California, Davis. And she is inspired by the intersections between art and anthropology, and we have already seen a video work of her where she gave insights into the daily life at a border and these very complex story of intersectioning and also porosity. And
is it working? Yes. I'll still just 5 minutes because I took my time for the video, but I wanted to say that I think all these talks were very well curated by the Disruption Lab and Tatiana, because really it resonates at different levels, from a life experience, which was the first case, from your analysis, which was really punctual, Petra, and all these themes that keep coming back. No, and my level, my video was made more as a day at the border, 24 hours shooting in the same day, and what happened. And it was not staged. It was simply all happened by chance. And I lived there 6 years in Tijuana as an anthropologist of art. So I was studying artists, architects, and I collaborated with many, many people there to work around this concept of border and frontiers. And when I arrived was September 11, so I arrived thinking that the border were very crossable, and it was the 90s, it was the period in which we were thinking that hybridity and mixing, crossing, and being multiple was possible. And of course, September 11 arrived, and I never felt so weirdly trapped in a nation as I felt in Mexico in those days, because they closed the border. So I needed to get to my flight in San Diego, which is like 25 miles away. It's not that far, and I couldn't just cross. And it was really a weird sensation. And I always thought I need to come back and live here longer, understand better this place. And so I moved there. I was supposed to stay 6 months, and I stayed 6 years. And then I left again, and I came back after a while, and I decided to do this video in one day. And I saw scenes like, for example, the crossing, no, of the 2 migrants that you saw in the video, that I never saw before in all those years. And it was very weird, because the border appeared in all its stupidity too. So from the bodybuilding made under the border by Mexican, probably, to the US side that were trying to rebuild at the same time as the wall, because the wall got corroded by the water 24 hours per day. It was so ridiculous to see that how this border was lived in very different ways from one side to the other, and so tragic. And at the same time, you have the border multiplies. No? At times it's double, at times it tripled. There are like 350 million people that cross that border each year. It's quite incredible. 500,000 illegal. So people cross. People keep crossing. So all this technology, the paradox of all these technologies, just that it gets more elaborate, but there are going to be always more elaborate ways to cross it anyway, which I found it fantastic. And for me, that part, I always discuss with Tatiana that there is a very somber and a negative way of thinking from an activist point of view. And I want to always push her to think more joyfully. And that's my joy, to know that there are always new tricks that are going to be happily invented to cross these terrible borders. And my experience in Tijuana has been that the borders, which is really tragic, no? Just 50% of Tijuana can cross, but the other 50 cannot. And their life are all determined by the wall anyway, even if they don't cross, no? My experience is that the level of creativity and the level of resistance is very high around these borders. And that's the part that I got most interested in those 6 years. So many scenes in the video, I think, are coming from there, no? So as I was saying, the bodybuilders, even the plants, no? The plants represent Mexico. And they are, the seeds were planted under the wall, and they were growing, and people were very happy because they were growing higher than the wall, no? So it felt like a nationalism against the other. Or, for example, you saw the end, also in Petra's image, I think there was the border finishes, no? It looks like the wall finishes, so you can. For example, the image we shot is because from the States is when I moved with the camera very quickly on the other side. And there it starts all the discourse of the sensors and the invisible control that is at work. No? So I walk on the other side, I shot very quickly, there was nothing. I'm also a US citizen, so I have theoretically the right, but I didn't have obviously the permits to film, no? In, I think, 3 seconds, helicopters, cars, everybody was coming. So the invisibility of the control has always the other side, which is an hyper-visibility of coming to catch you, no? So obviously I just went back to Mexico. So I did like this around the wall, no? But the strong presence of control that is invisible, visible is like a schizophrenia that is permanently present in the border. Those, the wall that you saw in the film is the aircraft carrier of the first Iraq war of the US. So the US just brought those parts of the aircraft carriers and they moved it between Mexico and the United States. So of course, all my Mexican friends always say, symbolically they brought the war here, which is true. There is nothing we can do about it. But I love the fact that the water eats the wall. So there is a continuous fight between what you want to limit, who belongs, and who doesn't belong and wants to belong. And I think the main questions of the video for me, that's why it ends with Rilke, which made me laugh because I thought a lot of German references in the film, by chance, is this one, where you want to be born. The right of wanting to know where to, and choose where you want to be born in some way every day. And it goes back to your presentation in which you were saying, in the moment you are born, you sign a contract that you never signed, actually. That you happen it happens to be your life in spite of you, because where you were born is by chance.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this, for really interesting insights into different and partly overlapping issues around the questions of algorithms, borders, migration, and control. I would now begin the discussion with you of a couple of issues, and then later on we will open the discussion to the public also, online and here. On spot. And I would love to know, like, from all of you, actually, what do you think, what is the most effective way in your area of work to hold, the powerful accountable? What are, mechanisms to make some changes? Sanjana, do you want to start?
Should I just go first? Okay. I mean, I think going into it as like a journalist, more so than like a researcher or an activist first and foremost. I think a lot of the time it's about establishing that like a practice has taken place or that something is happening, because I think often once you get proof of that, or often once you can demonstrate that there's a certain tactic or a certain kind of like process in place. I mean, Petra talks about like automated decision making, and once you can demonstrate that's in place, it offers a lot of like intervention points. So you can work with like legal clinics to produce like litigation, you can work with activist groups to kind of understand how those things manifest. But I think in terms of like effective ways of producing some kind of change, I think it's like a patchwork of all of those tactics, and it's not really like one way of doing it, which I feel like, yeah, maybe it's a bit of a cop-out of an answer, but yeah, I don't know.
From my point of view as an artist is creativity, and so finding tricks around power, and then probably hope. Rebecca Solnit, who is an important reference in feminist terms, etc., and she wrote a book about hope and the power of hoping.
As hoping is probably not enough, Petra, maybe you can also outline a little bit which kind of like legal mechanisms or tool you see which might be effective to, like for counter control of these systems deployed.
Absolutely. Although I do think hope is actually essential, and hope is also a discipline, like Maria Makaba, an abolitionist writer, reminds us. So I really, really like that intervention. But from a legal perspective, there's been some interesting moves that a few of us have been trying. In particular, I want to draw attention to an amazing coalition of civil society organizations and some researchers like myself and others who are trying to think through, okay, so we know that these technologies are very harmful, and currently there really isn't a lot of law to kind of pin responsibility to in this kind of scaffolding. And again, I should just preface this by saying, I don't think the human rights framework is necessarily perfect either, right? There's a lot of holes. It's based around individual rights holders as opposed to, let's say, like a collective right to privacy, or again, even like a systemic understanding of why certain practices are happening. But on the other hand, I guess it's better than nothing. And starting there can be quite helpful. So in the EU, for example, there's an ongoing discussion about this new proposed regulation to regulate artificial intelligence, or the AI Act, as it's colloquially known. It's similar to the General Data Protection Regulation, or the GDPR, as in it's kind of an omnibus piece of lawmaking that attempts to bring together a lot of different AI manifestations and regulate them, including border tech. And so this coalition started by EDRI, Access Now, PICUM, and a few others. We've been trying to really think through, what could this AI Act look like for it to foreground protection and safety and human rights of people on the move as they're impacted by AI. And if you want to look it up, there's a series of recommendations that we've been making to policymakers over the last year or so. But perhaps not surprisingly, again, given the kind of political reality of migration and migration policymaking, the uptake has not been the best. Although, again, this is where hope comes into it. I think at least it's a starting point, and it's a conversation. And there's also something to be said about putting something on the public record and saying, you know what, we are fighting for this. And even if it's not taken up in this act right now, perhaps it will be in the future. But definitely stay tuned, because it's not finished just yet. And this act is still making its way through the regulatory lawmaking. So maybe we will get a hopeful surprise in the future.
Thank you. Srishti, in your case, basically the attackers are kind of like loosely or closely connected to the government. So what kind of strategies or tactics do you think are useful to combat digital violence in India?
Thank you so much for actually listening to me. I think awareness is something which is very important. So when this happened with me, I was not really aware of the concept of trolling and how far-fetched it can be. So awareness, and also awareness of the way it impacts you. So as a woman, it would impact you differently. As a man, it would impact you differently. As a person from a lower caste, or um, people from a different religion or a minority, they would have a different experience. And I can assume that the situation for them would be much harsh than it was for me. I think awareness is something which is a key. I also believe that it's very important to be very well aware of how technology is interacting with everyday life. So public shaming has been a phenomenon ever since the civilizations have been there. But public shaming on an online platform, in a digital platform, is something that we really need to keep up ourselves up with. So it's a new technology, it's a new social media world. So one has to be very much aware of how people interact over there. I think that is also very important. Then, of course, the digital security is something that one has to look into. So I was not very aware that how easily they are able to access our private information, and how easily it is. Um, it's so easy to dox it. So now, as I'm more aware, so I control the information that is there about me on the internet. So that's another thing to do. And of course, out of all these things, one of the really important things is to look after the mental health. And in situations like this, I think that entire episode became a digital prison for me because it was just in my own head. Like I was dealing with it in a very difficult emotional state, and keeping up with your mental health is also something which I would recommend.
Thank you very much. I think mental health is extremely important and crucial in all of the fields on both sides of the spectrum. For example, like in the US and Mexico, immigrants in surveys spoke about the impact that, for example, these ankle trackers and these constant GPS monitoring has on them. And there were like a high percentage where like they couldn't sleep anymore. They were completely stressed out. Some had suicidal thoughts. So I think what you said also, that these kind of like their perspectives is often missing, is something that's really important for the discussions around tech, like what's really the emotional and everyday impact of this technology. So maybe those of you who interviewed migrants for their research and people affected, maybe you could just briefly explain a little bit how the perception by these people of the technology and the impact of the technology was?
I didn't interview migrants specifically on that, but I can tell you that the the panopticon presentation before, again, was very appropriate, because many times this system of GPS or controlling, they're not even followed, but you think they are. That's what drives you insane, in the sense that your perception is that you're constantly under surveillance. Even if you're not, you wouldn't know if you are or you're not.
It's like stalking. If you have a stalker, like even if the stalker's doing nothing, he's always in your thoughts.
He could do it.
Yeah, I mean, very briefly, like, I think one of the crucial things, again, as like a journalist working in this area, is that often you speak to vulnerable people, people who've like had traumatic experiences, people who are speaking to a journalist in the hopes that something can be done about their situation. And so it's like you have to enter into that relationship with something to give back to people, or at least some like reciprocity or an understanding that like not everything you do as like a journalist is going to be necessarily beneficial to them. You're not always like the ideal person for them to speak to, and some organizations and some migrants' rights organizations in the UK, for example, won't speak to you as a journalist now like anymore if you're not a migrant, or if you don't have like a recommendation from another organization, because there's so many cases of like big news organizations coming in, essentially mining, I think what Petra's spoken about as well, like mining poverty, trauma porn from people who are in really vulnerable situations and using that to tell a certain story. So I think there's like a certain responsibility there. But I think one of the things that's come out from interviewing people on the move and people who are racialized as part of the projects that I've done is that a lot of people, the perniciousness of these technologies, as Fiamma just spoke about, is that you often don't know what's actually being acted on you, what's actually surveilling you. There's often very little recourse to find out how it actually works, and even if you find out how it actually works, there's actually very little you can do to stop it. So in the case of the GPS tagging, it's like a condition of immigration bail. So if you say that, no, I actually don't want to do this, you actually just get sent back to prison. So it's about making sure that there's like, I don't know, some kind of understanding of that dynamic between you as a journalist and the person you're speaking to, and also thinking carefully about what like emotional responsibility you have there as like an individual, which maybe again is like a bit of a generic answer, but yeah.
Thank you very much. Maybe also Petra, if you could talk about your field research in the different countries, and not just how the migrants perceive the negative impact of tech, but maybe also how migrants themselves use technology to circumvent these border technologies and surveillance apparatus, or how aware they are of the different levels of surveillance.
Sure, and you know, I really, really appreciate that framing of always needing to pay attention to what our work is doing in these spaces. And you know, this is where my maybe anthropology hat comes on. We don't always get it right either. Actually, in fact, anthropology has been implicated in all sorts of problematic things, but that's for a different talk. But you know, I think the one thing that the methodology does have going for it is time. And if you do it carefully and critically and slowly and repeatedly, you do notice these strands of analysis perhaps come out when you spend time with one person or two people or five people over a prolonged period of time. And so in my work, and again, I never want to speak for anybody or for a particular community, but some themes that have come out are precisely around this kind of dehumanization of people feeling like they're reduced to data points or fingerprints. And even sometimes quite sharply, I always think of this one conversation that I had with a man from Syria who was detained by the Assad regime. And he was saying that even something as innocuous as an iris scanner actually reminded him of some of the torture that he experienced in the Assad prison systems. So sometimes I think people who develop this technology don't, again, think about what the embodiment of it actually is like. And, you know, when you're a software engineer somewhere far away, like Palo Alto or, you know, Berlin or wherever, without lived experience of movement and migration and incarceration, then it can be difficult to put yourself really in the shoes of somebody there. That's why I think, again, foregrounding not only the lived experiences of people who are affected, but actually even going a step further and shifting the balance of power in terms of what kind of work we support, where funding is going, and who, again, is not only like at the proverbial table, but who is building these tables, who is actually deciding what projects look like. And one shameless plug, at the Migration and Tech Monitor, we are in a very, very tiny way trying to do this. We're starting a fellowship program for people on the move who are doing work themselves on surveillance technology, funding people on the ground in forced migration settings, and not in a prescriptive way, but rather moving resources into communities to then also perhaps get at the last point and looking at technology also as a method of resistance and creativity. Because, I mean, for me, the last 5 years have been about pointing out all the terrible things, which, okay, like 90% of it is pretty bad, but there's also a lot of creativity, a lot of resistance, a lot of contestation that technology can be used for, particularly by mobile communities. So I'm really excited to see what we will see in the next coming years as hopefully more resources are sent that way too.
Thank you very much. I think it's really important to diversify the conversations and also like who's designing, who's talking about technology and the problems surrounding technology, because otherwise we're just circling around the technological fixes. I would also love to diversify the debate a little bit and open up the round to questions of the public. I have a lot more questions, but I think that the audience might have some questions too. So are there any questions from the audience? Yeah.
Hi, thank you. This is a really amazing discussion. I really took a lot from it. I used to work here, and I've been in Iraq for the past year and a half, working as a journalist and also a researcher. And I just kept thinking throughout this discussion about all of the young people there who face so many challenges.
Can you put put the microphone a little bit closer to your mouth?
What can we be doing, or based on your experiences, to support to actually go out and help communities? Or I'm thinking of young people, particularly in Iraq and other countries who face so many systemic barriers in our countries. I feel like so much more needs to be done, and I know all of your different work touches on that, but just, yeah, I mean, I'd be really curious to open that question out to the panel. Because, I mean, when I say we, I mean members of the public, you know.
I can give it a go. I mean, I think it's a big question, and I think there is also, to some extent, like, to what extent can any of us as individuals do that? So I think it's kind of about acting in concert and like acting in solidarity, as well as also putting our money where our mouth is. So, I mean, on an unrelated, slightly field, like I work for an organization called Airwars, and we monitor obviously airstrikes and civilian casualties in Iraq and Syria. And one of the things that we try to do is work with people from conflict-affected areas to kind of better understand local dynamics and to also try and better understand like the impact this has on civilian populations. And we don't work with people under the age of 18 from those conflicts at the moment in time, but like I think it's one of those things where it's about letting people tell their own stories, and so it's about also providing opportunities for people to feel safe and secure and supported, and also not to worry about reprisal or not to worry about that negatively impacting. For example, like I know in the UK, if you speak to the media about your experiences in the immigration system, that often has a negative impact on your actual visa application. So I mean, things like that, where it's like making sure you're providing a supportive and safe environment for people who are marginalized or racialized or otherwise in those positions to be able to speak freely about their experiences. That's kind of, from the top of my head, the first thing that comes to mind. I'm sure there's like lots of other stuff I'm missing, but yeah.
Petra, do you want to answer also?
I guess just perhaps to add, I mean, part of it is, yeah, increasing awareness of what is going on and what some of the impacts really are, both in terms of kind of contextual specificity, so looking at the manifestations in, you know, places like Iraq, Syria, and others that are, I'm sure, of interest to the room, but also then zooming out and looking at it globally, because so much of this is a global story, and it is a story of, you know, historical oppression of particular groups. And yes, now we're looking at it through this perhaps newish lens of technology or surveillance or AI or whatever the next sexy term is, right? But really, we're talking about power differentials and how they manifest across the world. And so I think having a little bit of like a two-part way of looking at these issues can be helpful too.
I think that's a very important point, because very often like local companies or Western companies play a big role in grievances and the consequences basically like have to be borne by people in other countries, and journalists can also like hold these companies accountable here basically for what's happening all over the world. Thank you. And Srishti, maybe maybe you could tell us, like, in this really hard time where you had to bear all this hate, like, did you feel solidarity, or what helped you? Who helped you?
So I feel I did felt solidarity, but most of the solidarity was off the record, because there were editorials written at the time that even the thought of standing up for me gives chills to people, because the trolls will also come after them. And so it was very lonely, but the people were helping me, like finding the lawyers or, you know, just the places to hide. My colleagues helped me a lot. So it was indeed a bit of a bit of lonely journey, but at the same time I've realized that it's very important to create space for solidarity. And in fact, this is what my book is also about. So my book is not just about my own experience, but I've reached out to multiple such people in India, especially from the marginalized groups, to tell their stories. They are not people who are actually high profile people or who have social support, but very ordinary people, people who are teachers, professors, pilots, people who don't have any sort of understanding of what trolling is. But this particular phenomena has really impacted them in the real life, in every aspect of their life, from them losing their jobs to actually being harassed so much that they have to release a statement that they are mentally unstable for saying something like this. So, and also to a very large extent, it's a very political trolling, and it's done with an agenda to really demarcate a line that you cannot say something on religion or you cannot say something on this government. So it's a very strong political tool which is currently used. And it's not just India. It's also the same situation in China. It's the same situation in Russia. It's the same situation in almost every other authoritarian country, in fact, in Turkey as well. So I feel that there's also, so while, so it's been a long process. Initially, I felt it was a bit lonely, but as of now, I feel that I'm part of a group. I've met people who have faced situations like me, and as of now, I feel a bit connected.
Thank you very much. It's really an important point that is like what we might call trolling. It's actually like digital violence that is very often also connected to real world violence, physical violence. And it's a worldwide phenomena that is really to be researched, because there's a lot of data lacking, and this is just starting. And there have to be strategies and also responsibilities for that kind of behaviors. There's another question.
These are all really incredible presentations, so thank you. My head's swimming with ideas, and I'm also thinking about a time that I spent on the US-Mexico border for a project, very, very creative project that was the No Border Camps that happened there almost 20 years ago, called Delete the Border. And there were some hackers from Tijuana who helped organize that, and I met fantastic creative people there. Around that time, I came across this quote from Baudrillard, who said that Disney World was created so that we would think the rest of the world is a free place. That you go to this amusement park and it's like this fake story, but it's really that like you're living in a fake world already. And with that in mind, I'm also trying to think about how do we hack this idea that the technosphere, the virtual realm, this cybernetic regime that is getting worse and worse, how do we hack this idea that that's a liberating space? And like we really maybe need to fight back in terms of like refusing to adapt ourselves to becoming digital citizens. And recently there's a Czech group called Kino Lab that has made a documentary called Digital Dissidents, and it's about fighting for our analog rights. So that if you have to deal with, let's say, immigration border situation, you have the right. We need to fight for the right that you can speak to a human being, and not have to fill out these codes and these, becoming more and more like a digital labyrinth that you have to navigate and participate in these things that are disempowering to us. And I think I'm just wondering to ask all of you, how can we think about trying to hack this atmosphere that we're being told that the more we adapt to these digital environments, we're going to be liberated through them. And I'm thinking, how we have to go back towards how do we, get our feet back on the ground and be able to fight for our material earthly existence and fight for like not being stopped at various borders, not just geographical borders, but by these new walls that are being created by the virtual environments.
Thank you. You already gave some ideas, so maybe Petra, do you want to answer? Because you also had some ideas like how to cut through this very clean marketing campaigns of the companies and the tech bro sphere.
Thank you. That's such a beautiful question. And I think it's a really important one because it gets at that kind of core question of humanity that I think we're all trying to understand as it's increasingly becoming kind of techno-solutionist and in all these different ways that we look at it. I mean, I think again here it's a bit of a two-parter because we need contextual specificity and looking at perhaps some of the most violent manifestations of this, like at the border or in carcerality in prisons, but then also finding ways to get the average public or policymakers to care about it. And that's the duality that I sometimes struggle with too, because sometimes when you focus in on a particular context, the rest of the world doesn't seem to care, or maybe they don't seem connected to it enough. So we must find ways to kind of bridge the narrative from what's actually happening on the margins of society, but then how it's actually impacting everybody. But I think it also then goes beyond that, and it's actually about a broader rethink, like you posed in your question about what is our relationship to technology and digitization. And there's been some really, really interesting work being done on, for example, calling for not only just like a moratorium or red lines around certain technology, whether border tech or automated weapons in war or welfare algorithms and others, but also just to getting the technology space to rethink how they relate to themselves and also us. I mean, some people have been calling for like a slow AI movement, completely in opposition to the kind of Zuckerberg motto of move fast and break things. I don't know if that goes far enough for me. Like, I think there are actually some manifestations that just should not be happening, and slow AI is not going to fix it. But there's a really interesting kind of concept too, pushed forward by Johnny Penn. He's a theorist at Cambridge, of rest engineering, of kind of getting engineers and folks in the private sector space to think of their role also as radical when they take things slow, when they rest, and when they're not actually involved in these kind of global manifestations of, again, this kind of AI arms race that we're talking about, because it is also very geopolitical, right? And I think this is the hard part when we as individuals or communities are trying to enact change, because we are all part of this global system that has essentially decided that techno-solutionism is the way to go. So I think we have to approach it in these multi-nodal ways, perhaps. But yeah, I'd be curious what others think.
I say something? But maybe because I don't like Baudrillard, but for example, when there was the Iraq war, and you used to say that this basically digital way of approaching the enemy made it like the war didn't exist. I was in total disagreement. I think that unfortunately the war was multiplied on different level. At the same time, when you were saying maybe we should go back to an analog way of relating, to communication, I don't think it would work. I think we should, again, multiply. Because if you think about it, for example, I work a lot with the Zapatist movement in the 90s, which, the Maya, different Maya groups that take arms and go against the government and against NAFTA, the treaty for the agreement between Canada, United States, and Mexico. Their use of technology, their use of communication is what saved them. Is exactly what really made them survive the desaparecidos method that all the other guerrilla were in the Central America were erased. So I'm not sure we can go back. I think the only strategies to fight this power is to multiply strategies.
Thank you. Very interesting point. Also, like how people can use technology to reframe the debate. Also, I would love to include some digital voices also now. So, Alice, are there some questions coming from the internet, social media channels?
So I have a question for Srishti and another one for everyone, actually. So if we have time, we'll make two. So the first one, do you think the attack against you was part of the larger design by the Indian government to silence critics and journalists? What do you think are the implications of this for a country like India, which calls itself a democracy?
I definitely think that it was a part of a larger plan by Government of India to stifle the dissent in India. So as of now, it's a breaking news in India that India's current opposition leader, the prime opposition to India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi, Mr. Rahul Gandhi, is actually disqualified from being a lawmaker just because he criticized Mr. Modi. He's not the only one who is there. So many journalists, activists, lawyers, people who dissent against the Prime Minister Narendra Modi and his regime in India are stifled in this way. Some people are physically harassed while most of them are trolled online. So, yeah, I definitely think that it is a part of a larger pattern. And it's very alarming for Indian democracy, particularly because if Indian democracy fails, if this happens, so it's not just going to be limited to the borders of India. It has wider implications for the entire world. And the speed with which the civil liberties in India are damaged or, just being thrown out is mind blowing. So it's been almost 9 years that Mr. Modi is the Prime Minister of India. Next year are the general elections. And in 9 years, the very basic nature of India has changed. It's not just the structural institutional support that India had. I think it's the very nature of the country has changed a lot, and this is what we are seeing at this point. So I do believe that the world should watch what's happening in India with much more gaze and attention.
Thank you. Then maybe the last question for everybody.
Yeah, so it's related to the database that was mentioned by Sanjana, but I think really everyone can answer on that. So if this database is bad, should we then collect less data? And which data do you actually think are instead useful and good to be collected?
Tricky one.
Damn. That's a big question. I mean, I think first and foremost, I'm like not a policymaker or a technologist. So like some of those really specific technical things, probably I'm not even the best person to speak on it. But like things like the Home Office biometrics database that we talked about, the databases that Petra talks about, some of the kind of invisible things that are in motion at the US-Mexico border. I think the problem isn't just that they exist and they collect data, but they often are excessive. So they collect data in excess of like what's basically needed for them to function. And I have a lot of problems with that argument too, but I think that's like the fundamental problem is like with the databases in the UK that I often focus on, because they can collect data and because those mechanisms are in place and it's legal and the infrastructure is there, they often go way beyond what actually needs to happen for like the administration of that basic service. So with the Home Office biometric service, there's actually no reason for the police to have access to both police databases and immigration databases. Whether databases should exist at all is like a whole other thing, and I'm not going to get into it, but I think it's one of those questions where there just needs to be more safeguards, and not just safeguards, but safeguards that actually matter, which sounds kind of what's similar to what Petra was talking about with the coalition that's trying to create regulations for the AI Act in the EU. Maybe that's something that links into it, I don't know.
Thank you very much. Maybe last question.
Thank you for your presentations. They were all very, very, very nice. So we spoke a lot about people trying to come into, to cross through a border, so go from outside to inside. And I wonder, what do you think about this sort of, it seems like recently, like a rise in more and more borders and technology around borders and surveillance. So thinking about it from sort of a crisis of the patriarchy or of masculinity in a way, of the nation state, do you see sort of a crisis in the nation state? And maybe does that give us any sort of political ideas or imaginations about how could we, from inside the nation states that people want to come into, what could we do, to help? And
what do we do? I don't know. But I do definitely see in the video, for example, the wall is a macho man, no? It's like a patriarchal presence, how can I say, very imposing, no? And the voiceover is a woman, is actually a Mexican woman that lived in the States for many years. So I'm not sure what the solution is, but I'm sure that the way is to cross it is maybe not be inside or outside, is to cross it, is to be able to cross it. Then the legal issues, the physical issues, all of this has to be addressed, obviously, no? But the main right is to cross, I think.
Probably it would be the start of a longer and larger debate, and we can then we can have it today and here, because time is already almost over, and it was a really great debate with a lot of points, with a lot of concrete technological projects and grievances all over the world. So I think it's a good starting point for the deeper dives into different aspects around it. And I think it was also pretty clear that there's no easy solution or not one approach to these many challenges that we face, and that also like different sectors of society have to work together, IT experts, refugees, organizations, migrants themselves, and also the perspectives of the people affected have to be more included in the debates, but also like in the design of these kinds of databases, products, technologies, and concepts. Thank you very much. And we are closing with Tatiana, who will do the closing of the event. Thanks.
Thank you so much for this very important panel, very interesting, and I think we will have a lot to discuss and reflect also tomorrow. And Fiamma, I wanted to tell you that won't be only a negative approach, but tomorrow there will be also a lot of resistance. So, because I think there are two things that come together. So tomorrow we open the doors a bit earlier at 4, and the first panel is at 4:30, and is about revisiting the Genoa G8 2001. Another world is possible, and it needs another kind of computing. And in this panel we will speak about the trial of the Genova G8, but also what came after, so ideas of resistance that also brought some more positivity after this episode that was really terrible for many. And the panel will be with Carlo Bachschmidt, MF, and Dan McKillen. And after that, we will have a panel called Targeted by Surveillance, Julian Assange, WikiLeaks, and Network Repression. And will come Stella Assange, the wife of Julian Assange, Kevin Gozzola, and Stefania Maurizi. And this will be around the situation of Julian, but also about the discourse of technological repression in relation to WikiLeaks. After that, we will have a screening of Ithaca that is also related to the situation of Julian Assange and the fight of Stella Assange and the father of Assange to free him. The film is in English with German subtitle. And then suddenly, on Sunday, finally, we will have a workshop program. Still, there are some places free for the workshop, so I will suggest you to register online if you didn't do yet. The workshop in the morning actually is with Sanjana and Imogen, is called ISIS Prison Break, deploying open source and visual methods for investigations. It's also a workshop we do in cooperation with Airwars, so Sanjana will be back for this, and together with Imogen Piper. And then we will have a workshop that is the follow-up of the panel of tomorrow about the Genoa G8 2001, called a Grassroots Media Forensic Toolbox, with Carlo Bachschmidt and Manolo Luppichini, in which we will discuss not only in deepening the situation that will be presented tomorrow in terms of the forensic strategy in relationship to free the activists and fight for the activists after the G8, but also in general think about what are the grassroots media techniques in this kind of situation. So I conclude here, and I say goodbye to everyone, the people here in Berlin and also the people following online, and we will meet again tomorrow. Thank you.